The previous episode ended with Rose agreeing with Theodore to act out a plan in public so they could break off their engagement. So, she said in front of everyone, "The next lesson is at the church, isn't it? I don't want to walk there." "That's right, Prince Theodore," she continued. "Wouldn't you like to carry me to the church?" Theodore approached her and whispered, "Miss Rose, I understand this is part of our plan, but there's no need to go this far." And Rose replied, "Rose de Charlier is not suitable to be the crown princess. I'm doing this so I can show everyone how proud I am." Then, with sadness and tension, she said, "Please, let me continue what I'm doing." Theodore looked at her with tension. Suddenly, her expression changed rapidly, and she said to him, "There's no problem, is there? We are engaged after all." He hit his head and sighed, saying, "I don't think I have a choice, Miss Rose." So he did it and carried her in his arms. Rose thought to herself shyly, "His arms are so strong, and his chest is so close." The students started looking at them and saying, "Is the prince really so obedient? What a pitiful state, Prince Theodore." So, feeling embarrassed, Rose thought to herself, "Why am I so excited? The prince is just acting. I need to act more arrogantly." Then the scene changes, and a girl is serving Rose tea, saying, "Miss Rose, these are the highest quality tea leaves in the entire kingdom." But Rose, continuing with her plan, said arrogantly, "As long as it's just tea, I'm not satisfied with it. Don't you have something sweet?" Then she looked at one of the girls and said, "Hey, you there. How about going to the city's shopping street and getting me some macarons?" The girl nervously replied, "You mean me? I have a class now." Then another girl said to her, "Miss Rose, isn't there something else you want?" Rose looked at her angrily and said, "How dare you oppose a member of the Charlier house?" So the girl nervously said, "No, we never meant that." Meanwhile, Theodore was watching the students who were whispering, saying, "Can she say whatever she wants because she's from the Charlier house? Isn't she deliberately asking for the impossible?" At that moment, Rose stood up and shouted at the girl, "Hurry up and do as I asked! Who do you think I am?" At the same time, she thought to herself, "That's right. This can only be considered bullying. But to make everyone hate me as the villain, I have to do it." Theodore said nervously, "Miss Rose, that's enough." Suddenly, Iris came up to her and said, "I can go and get it for you." Rose thought to herself nervously, "This is the main heroine, Iris?" Then she said to her, "Why would you do that?" "So," Iris whispered to her, "because on the day of Theodore's birthday party you encouraged me, so—" So she smiled at her and said, "Let me return the favor." Rose thought to herself shyly, "Iris, she's such a good girl. I can't allow myself to act like this." So she smiled at her and said, "Of course, you seem helpful," and indeed she went and brought her the sweets she had asked for. She tried to feed Theodore, saying, "Prince Theodore," but he turned his head to the other side and said, "This is going too far." But Rose said to him, "If that's the case, would you feed me one? I think I'm not acting arrogant enough. How about this?" And she teased him, saying, "Or perhaps you want to eat it mouth to mouth." Theodore looked at her in silence. Suddenly, he stood up angrily and looked at her silently for a moment. Then, with a flushed face, he grabbed her, saying, "Miss Rose, come with me for a moment." He took her to an empty place and put his hands on his face, sweating, saying, "Damn it, you." Then he looked at her and said, "You've gone too far this time." But Rose said to him, even that wasn't far enough. Theodore, in tension, said, "If you're going to do that, be more natural." And Rose suddenly said to him, "By the way—" Here, she offered him a candy, saying, "Would you like some, Prince Theodore? After all, Iris went out of her way to buy them for us." He started to sweat, and his face turned red. Then he said to her, "It can't be. This is—" So he approached her, and the candy basket fell from her hand. He said to her, "Miss Rose, did you take the sedatives as you were supposed to?" But in shock, she put her hand on her mouth and said, "Sedatives? If you mean that medicine, yes, every day." But she remembered and said to herself, "That's right. Today, I fell asleep late." Theodore looked at her angrily and said, Didn't I tell you if one of us goes to lust, the other will also be pulled into this lust? Then he started to kiss her, and she said to herself, my ears. Then Theodore looked at her, sweating profusely, and kept doing it. Rose kept saying to herself, what do I do? We're going to lust at school. Theodore said to her, Miss Rose, what happened to the sedatives I gave you? Rose replied, trembling, I'm sorry. I left them at the palace. So he said to her, taking out a bottle of medicine, then I understand. I'll give you one of mine. Suddenly he put one in her mouth, so she said to herself shyly, His Highness's fingers touched my lips. I tremble just from his touch. My body is very hot. Theodore looked at her and said, Can you swallow it? She said, Yes. Then he said to her, I think we're okay now. Then Rosie said to herself after he put his hands on her, Prince Theodore's hand is very soft. Theodore said to her, I think the medicine finally worked. She looked at him and said, I'm so sorry. Suddenly someone came in and said, Prince Theodore, I finally found you. Rose said to herself nervously, Is this one of Prince Theodore's servants? Theodore asked him, What is it? And the servant handed a letter to the prince, saying, A letter from the royal palace. Nervously, Rose said to herself, From the palace? An emergency. Theodore took the letter from the servant and said to him, I see. You may leave us. The servant bowed to him and said, Yes, my lord. Theodore began to read the letter, so she nervously said to him, Has something happened? So Theodore said, It's from my parents, from the king and queen. During the upcoming holiday, I must bring you to the palace. Terrible timing now that we were trying to stay away from each other. What is this disturbance? But if the invitation is from the king and queen, there is no room for refusal. Rose said to him, You're right. We'll get through this together, okay? Then the scene changes and they're in a carriage. Theodore asked her, This is the first time you've met my parents like this, isn't it? Rose replied, Yes. I visited the palace when I was a child with my parents. She thought to herself, Or did I understand that correctly? It was just a flashback scene in the game. I think that's how the story went. I should have paid more attention now that I'm in this situation. I've reviewed all of Rose's information. At the time, he told her, If you didn't have to go with me, it would have happened. You could have spent the holiday with whoever you wanted. It seems you have bad luck, too. You're sympathetic. To me? Rose said nervously. Prince Theodore, I thought you didn't care about me. He looked at her and sighed, then said, I don't care about you. Then he closed his eyes and said, Actually, I thought our personalities didn't match. So Rose said to him, smiling, Yes, you're right. Theodore said to her, But now, we're partners with the same goal in mind. I want us to get out of this. So she looked at him in astonishment and said, Prince Theodore. Then she looked at him shyly and said to herself, He's a really strict prince. I'm a character. I want to add to his story now. When he saw her like this, he asked himself, Is she okay? Suddenly the carriage stumbled over a stone, and Rose fell onto Theodore, and they became close to each other. She closed her eyes and said to herself shyly, Impossible. He's going to kiss me.